So this is a tutorial showing how I painted the pink water lily using Winsor and Newton's watercolor marker range. I do quite a lot of flower paintings using the aqua marker range of watercolor markers, and somebody suggested that I should try doing a picture solely using Winsor and Newton's watercolor marker range. So I thought, yeah, okay, I've only got a few of the markers, but I'll give it a go. So the first thing that I did was pencil out this pink water lily and then get ready to use the markers on it. So these are the Winsor and Newton watercolor markers I've got, so kind of only a handful, but enough of the colors that I needed to try and make this work. So I start with one of the left-hand petals here using a really nice purpley kind of color called mauve. So I'm just using the brush tip of the Winsor and Newton watercolor marker to do some nice flick kind of strokes, starting dark at the bottom, getting lighter as I work the way up. And then I'm using cadmium red deep hue, really nice red there, to try and make sure that when these two blend together, it's not too purple, it's got kind of a red kind of color in there as well, a red edge to it, which is what this pink water lily had. When I start blending the colours together, I'm using nice clean water and I'm using a synthetic brush. This is a size 4 graduate synthetic brush. Sometimes it's good to use a sable brush, but I find the synthetic brushes just mix the colours together on the paper a little bit more easily. And you can see me adding more water now, running along the top edge of this petal with clean water, hoping that it will then run down, spread outwards, and sort of bloom into the colour I'm already using, which will give me a kind of texture effect, but it'll also give me kind of light near the top of the petal towards dark near the bottom. Notice how I'm not being too fussy with it. I've put on the water, I'm not overworking it, I'm just leaving it now, so letting the water and the colour do its own thing, run about a little bit in its own kind of way. So I start this next petal. I'm trying to make sure that I do one that is separate and there is a gap between the first one that I've done, otherwise what will happen is the two will flood together, so I'm trying to avoid that happening by making sure that each petal that I do in this first stage, there's a gap between it and the last one that I've done. So again, you can see me adding the mauve and the cadmium deep red hue, and I'm mixing them together using the water and trying to make sure that the petals are darker near the base and then they are getting lighter towards the top, and I'm basically doing that by just keep replenishing the water and the brush as I move upwards on the petal, so it's going to be lighter near the top and darker near the bottom. And if you think you've got too much water on your brush, I've always got a big wad of tissue paper right next to the glass jar of water, so that if I think I got too much on, I can just wet off and dry off a little bit of that water. So as you see me start this petal, you can see that I've spaced around and jumped around doing all the petals separately. This is the first one that I'm doing that is close to one that I've already painted, and it looks like everything's going okay. But as I'm doing this petal, I suddenly find that near the base where I've just done some, it's actually flooded across because the petal right next to it on the right hand side wasn't dry yet, and here you can see I point out with the brush where I've got a bit of flooding where two colours have kind of flooded into each other, but I can fix that later. So here I'm introducing a bit of orange, and I'm using this is cadmium orange hue, because on the edges of some of these petals there is a kind of a yellowy orange kind of tint, but I didn't have a yellow, so I had to kind of improvise, and obviously the closest color that I had to having a yellow was an orange, because I wanted to do this completely with just the Winsor and Newton markers that I had. So I thought, well, it's not too bad. Once I've got it wet with some water, it'll dry a little bit paler and it won't be such a bright orange. So I'm just trying to make a bit of an adaptation to make sure that I can keep using just the markers that I've got to do this, but do something that's close to the photo that I'm doing. But I actually don't mind too much because I'm always on at myself for making my pictures look too close to the photograph. So the fact that using the equipment that I've got here is forcing me to do something a little bit different and use a slightly different color, I'm absolutely fine with it. I'm actually enjoying it because also seeing as it's orange and I'm mostly using kind of purples, that's two of the secondary colors, so they go well together anyway, and the background, as you're going to find out, is going to be mostly greens, so I'm actually using a secondary color palette here of pretty much orange, purple and green, which will have a good kind of balanced look hopefully when the whole thing is finished. I think the key here was to make sure that I could dilute the orange though, so it wasn't too strong. I could get that water in, move it around with the brush, and so that there was just this hopefully subtle kind of like orange edge to this petal, and also a couple of the others that I have to do. I've got a bunch of the petals finished by this point, but I just wanted to show you what I'm doing here to kind of emphasize the inside and the outside of the petal. And the way that I'm doing this partly with the way I'm laying down the colours here, but also partly in the painting, is leaving a bit of a white, a very fine white edge between how I'm painting the interior of the petal, which is usually darker, and the outside edge, or the outside of the petal. So you can see as I'm adding water here and moving the colour up towards the top, I'm leaving that little really fine white edge between the inside and the outside to try and give it depth. With most of the petals done, this bottom petal opened out towards us had a very distinct kind of line pattern on it. So what I did here was I just got the mauve marker and I just started putting in some very rough, kind of sketchy, broken kind of lines to be these kind of veiny look that it's got there. And then I go in with the brush using some water, and I'm working very carefully here to try not to lift up the colour that's underneath, the base colour that I put on. So I'm just gently trying to work those lines to the left and to the right using a damp brush, not a really wet brush, to give this kind of diffuse, fuzzy, blurry kind of line in the middle to suggest these kind of veins that you can see running out on the petal up towards us. It kind of worked better than I expected, and it's a good example of how with watercolor markers you can lay the watercolor markers down on top of painting you've already done, and if you're just careful and subtle about the way you brush it and the amount of water that you add, then you can get an effect on top of your existing color that's there using this new marker color that you've put down. You do obviously have to be careful, because if you lift up both you end up just running them all together. At this point I had to try and fix that flooding incident from earlier, so a quick stroke of mauve there, and then I get some water on the brush and I work from the top of that petal down, and what I'm hoping is that I pick up the colour, sort of re-energize it and get it mixed together with the water back towards the bottom. Then once I hit the bottom I just start working that colour and the water mixing back towards the top, and that did seem to do the trick and kind of just fixed it luckily. For doing the centre, the little sort of polleny stameny bits, I just use mauve, and then I use some of the cadmium orange hue as well. And even though these shapes in the centre are usually brighter, because they're in the centre and they're kind of shadowed by all the petals around them, it does give them a slightly darker quality, slightly shadowed. So what I did was when I put down the orange and the mauve, I blend the mauve into the orange, and that would give this kind of darker orange with not too many highlights. So with most of the petals done, all I had to do was try and finish the flower at this stage, and then I would be able to move on to thinking about the background, which, as I'd hinted earlier, was going to be quite a lot of greens, because this is a water lily and it's sitting on a water lily pad and water. So here you can see some of my testers where I tried different combinations of green with different colours like mauve, like mid blue and like indigo, to try and get the kind of greens and kind of bluey greens that I wanted in the background. So here you can see me using Hooker's green, which is a good classic kind of watercolor green, but it can be a little bit bright and a bit unrealistic used just on its own. So I decided that I was going to kind of use different colors to make it darker and give it a different kind of feel. So I'm using a bit of mauve on top of this, and then also going in with a little bit of mid blue. So I'm using 3 colors here to give me what is a patch of water in the background. So I'm blending it together using the synthetic size 4 round brush again, and you should be able to spot just the other side of that petal towards the right hand side is a small little triangle where I haven't put any colour. So what you can see me doing is transferring colour that's already on the brush from doing the bit on the left, and just painting that directly onto this tiny little triangle of water which is just poking out from behind the petal. So just transferring some colour there works absolutely fine. Didn't need to put any new colour down. So now I'm doing one of the water lily pads. I want it to be really light, so I just put on some just a couple of strokes of green and blue, and I want to blend them together with lots of water so that they've got a really nice pale look to them. And I actually switched to using a sable brush here, a small sable, because it holds a lot more water, but I run into a problem. And as you can see, as I'm trying to blend the blue and greens together, using lots of water, you should be able to notice, as I try and rub away at it there, that the mid blue that I used here has actually stained the paper. Now this is something I don't usually come across that often, possibly because as soon as I put the markers on I virtually add water straight away, so they don't have time to. And I'm not quite sure why it's happened, because it hardly ever has happened to me before when I'm using these nice thicker watercolor papers, but it did. So I had to look at ways to fix that. So I tried once using a synthetic, twice using a synthetic, and also 3 times trying to blend in with a synthetic. And I lightened it a little bit, but you can look there, it's still there and it has stained that paper, and that's a bit of a problem. But I might be able to fix it because there is a pattern on top of each of the lily pads because it had rained. So there's a kind of whole bunch of little puddles of blobby bits of water all over the lily pads. So that's what you can see me doing here. So I've mixed a sort of blue and green mixture of colour here, and I'm trying to disguise the stains whilst also putting on this kind of rain droplet patches of water. I will come back to that in a second. What I first wanted to do was lighten this patch of water down in the bottom left corner, which I felt was too dark. So the way I do that is to just get lots of clean water on the brush, whack it down on top and start working it to mix it together with the colour that's already there, and then just basically brush it off into the white border, the bit that's not going to be seen. And hopefully I'm sweeping that colour off and out of the way, and it's made that patch lighter. Now what I'm doing is I'm adding some shadow to these little puddles of water that are on top of the lily pad, and I do that by adding some more green and blue together, and then using a very, very fine brush here to try and just put in these little shadowy bits of edges that give the puddles a bit of depth, but also allow me to add some slightly darker greens that will hide hopefully the blue stain that you can still see from that mid-blue marker that I used. These very, very small delicate shadows are supposed to suggest that these are patches of water actually sitting on top of the lily pad, so it's designed to give them a bit of depth. But once I'd done them, I thought they weren't dark enough. So this time I mixed up green, blue, and also put a bit of mauve in to give it an even darker kind of green feel. And I go in with the fine brush again, and I'm going over my shadows that I put on previously that, as you can see, you can barely see them, and I'm hoping that this slightly darker, deeper shadow here is going to have more of an effect and more of a contrast. And yes, it does, and it does help to hide some of those blue streaks still, but you know, you can still make them out, unfortunately. As a technique for doing the water droplets on the lily pads, it works well, so I roll it out and do the other 2 lily pads with it, and then I need to do something to give the flower some depth, to make it look like it's sitting on the lily pads and also the water. So here I'm adding some green in, and then I'm putting in some mauve and some blue marker, and then blending those all together with a brush to give some shadow underneath the lily pad to show that it's sitting on top of something, it's not just floating above the water. I keep the colour and the depth of the shadows very, very strong and dark while it's close to the petals, and I do this by not adding so much water. I'm not flooding it with water, I'm just adding enough to mix those colours together and, you know, getting them to run and brush over the surface of the paper. But as I work further away from the flower and I'm getting more out into the pond with the shadow, then what I do is I sort of either let the colour gradually run out so it gets lighter, or I'll dip the brush in the water and I'll add more water to it to dilute that shadow as we get further and further away from the centre. And again, I'm trying to do this gently and not too fussily. I know it doesn't look that way because I'm trying to be really careful not to mix the colour that I've put on top with the colour that I've already got going on underneath the shadow. Now what I have to do is use a dry brush, because what I want to try and do is pick out some very, very pale lines out of the colour that I've already put down, out of the shadow, because very, very close to the flower in the water is this kind of like a little line, like maybe where the edge of the water, the sort of like tension of the water is, and it causes a little kind of white edge. So what I try to do with a dry brush is just keep working away at those sections until I get those kind of white areas. And then it's mixing together green, mauve and mid-blue to get a nice dark greeny blue, which is going to be the shadows of the lily pads as they're sat in the water. So it's almost like a bit of an outline, a bit of edge along some of the edges of the lily pads, not all edges, because the light will be hitting some edges and there'll be hardly any shadow, but other parts of the lily pad, maybe just rising slightly out of the water, will get a little bit of a shadow. So that's what I'm doing here with a very, very fine brush, slightly customized brush that I think I've lost a few bristles on over the years. So as I just finish up doing a little bit of that shadow at the bottom there, underneath the flower, with a bit of rough kind of dry brushing, dark to light, it's time to start thinking about the water droplets. So for this I decided to just add a bit of the mauve and a bit of the cadmium deep red hue, mix those together, and then change to a much, much thinner, smaller brush, really tiny brush I'm using here. and I decided what I was going to do was do a kind of a moon type shape, a crescent type shape, and it would be darker on the top bit facing the light and then lighter on the bottom bit facing away from the light. So all I did then was get a little bit of water on the brush and then blend it in a little on the bottom edge. Now you can see that a little bit more clearer here because I go in a bit closer. So I do that kind of crescent moon type shape on the side that's actually facing the light, so that's going to be the shady bit, and then I get a bit of water on the brush and I blend the inside of that kind of moon shape. So it's soft on the inside, but the outer edge of it has got a very kind of hard edge, you know, dark and light hard edge. And after doing that a few times and sort of dotting little droplets around the flower, I decided that they needed a little bit of highlighting. So I decided to use a watercolor pencil, a white watercolor pencil here, to try and add some very subtle highlights. And in the light areas, it really didn't show up at all. But as you got into the slightly darker shades of the petals and you're putting the white on, it did show up a little bit. And it just gave me a little kind of white edge, like where the light is catching the edge of that water on some of those water droplets. So hopefully giving them just a teeny little bit more 3D, but not super bright, actually quite subtle, quite careful. So that's it, pretty much finished. If you like this tutorial and you found any of it useful, then please like, leave a comment, and also share and subscribe, because all of that really helps support the channel and keeps me motivated to keep producing work. Have a little look underneath, there's loads of links to some of my previous watercolor pictures.